Hello, and today we will begin with our introduction to the IELTS speaking. We are going to go through each part just as an introduction, of course. Okay, so the IELTS academic and the IELTS general candidates do the same exact speaking test, and it is marked in the same way. So let's take a look at the speaking part at a glance. Most of you know this, but if not, the IELTS speaking test lasts 11 to about 14 minutes. The test consists of three parts. Of course, you cannot use a dictionary, and as I said before, it's marked in the same way. So let's take a look at part one and what kinds of topics the examiner is going to ask you about. So they're going to ask you about maybe experiences you've had, your work, your studies, people you know, where you live, those kinds of questions. They're not going to ask you anything about like news that happened last week or how to solve a math problem, of course. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So what do they measure? A very fluent native speaker, for example, would get about an 8.5 to a 9 for the IELTS speaking. A candidate, that would be making lots of mistakes would get like around a band 5. It depends on why you need the IELTS exam in the first place. So requirements from universities and from immigration agencies vary. So most students that are in an undergraduate program might need around a 6, at least a 6. But for postgraduate study or maybe for immigration, you might need a 7. So you really need to know what band you are hoping to get. So let's take a look at what it measures, what IELTS speaking measures. So here are the 4 criteria. We have pronunciation, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, fluency, and coherence. And we're going to take a look at the 4 criteria individually. So you want to think, if somebody had to speak your language, somebody foreign had to speak your language, and they were being tested on your language, what would you listen for? Okay, that's basically these things here. Pronunciation, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and fluency and coherence. So pronunciation, let's take a look at these. Okay, photograph, photograph, measurement, measurement, breakthrough, breakthrough. What's your favorite film? I've had a delicious breakfast. So you want to practice your pronunciation. Your intonation is very important. You don't want to sound robotic. And know that IELTS examiners are listening out for speech which is easily understandable, which sounds natural. You can have an accent, of course, and still get high marks in pronunciation. It's how clear and understandable you are. Then we get to the lexical resource. And when we're talking about anything lexical, we're talking about vocabulary. So to get a high score on the IELTS speaking, you need a large vocabulary. For example, when the examiner asks you a question, you don't want to be answering with the same words that were in the question. Okay, so synonyms are very important. So here we have a little example. Instead of saying car, you can say automobile. Instead of saying hot, you can say it was a boiling day. Fast, speedy. Value as a verb here, appreciate, or helpful being beneficial. Just a small example. Okay, so grammatical range and accuracy. Let's take a look here. This you have to be very careful with, of course. So for a high band in IELTS speaking, you need to be able to form simple and complex sentences. The point is that they have to be correct. Sometimes you want to overcompensate and use or try to create a very complex grammatical, high level grammatical structure, and you're not accurate with it, so it makes things worse. So here we have the summer of 2012 have been very rainy. So that should be the summer of 2012 has been very rainy. Luisa wants for going to the beach next weekend. So we have the wants here. Luisa wants to go to the beach next weekend. During I was in Turkey, I enjoy going to the market. So think, what is wrong here? What else can I say? How else can I structure this to make it correct? And the answer would be, when I was in Turkey, I enjoyed going to the market. The history was my favorite subject in school. Should be, history was my favorite subject in school. Okay, we don't need an article in front of school subjects. I called up the man which I met yesterday. So here we have the mistake with the which. I called the man that I met yesterday. So now let's take a look at fluency and coherence. So you should be speaking natural speed, not a lot of silences, no silences, actually. What I mean to say is not a lot of hesitation. You don't want to be thinking too much like, what word should I use here? It has to be a nice, natural, fluid speech. You don't want to be repeating words. You want to use connector words like however, on the other hand, on the one hand, in my personal opinion, wording like that. And again, you want to be careful. You're not using the same vocabulary over and over again. So let's go into part 1 of the IELTS speaking. So this is going to last about 4 to 5 minutes. And the examiner will ask you to talk about yourself. And then they will maybe ask like 2 or 3 questions. So your house, your job, your school, your family, things like that that are pretty easy. So 4 to 5 minutes there. And then we get to part 2 of the IELTS speaking. This lasts 3 or 4 minutes. So what's going to happen here is you will be given a cue card, and it will say, describe it, for example, describe an interesting website you have visited. You should say when you visited and how you first learned about the website, what the website is about, and why you think it is interesting. So here, what happens is that you want to spend 1 minute, because you get 1 minute, and you want to write down notes on a piece of paper, what you're going to say. Not sentences, just very, very quick notes, like 1 or 2 words, so that you have a nice flow and you're not thinking about what to say, but it's a nice, fluid conversation. Okay, so you will need to speak for 1 to 2 minutes. I tell my students personally, keep talking until the examiner stops you by saying, thank you, and then you know that you've spoken enough. So after that, the examiner will ask you 2 or 3 questions about what you have said. And we get to part 3 here. So part 3 are questions that are related to the cue card. You need to express your thoughts and your feelings about this topic. So the cue card earlier was about the website, or a website. So the examiner might ask, whether you think young children should be allowed to access the internet, or whether the government should make sure that everyone has high-speed access. So it's going to be, of course, related to the cue card. And of course, the questions are going to be more difficult, and you won't have time to write down any possible answer. Okay. So the examiner, what are they looking for? As I said, you want to express your own thoughts. Mistakes are only considered serious if they are frequent and if you don't know you're making mistakes. So, for example, a native speaker will always make a mistake also. It's the train of thought. You're nervous, it's the day of the test, but we correct ourselves. The examiner can see that we know what we're saying. It's just maybe the stress is getting to us or whatever, or we're just losing our train of thought, trying to focus so long. But very advanced learners normally get around 7 or 8, even if they make few mistakes. Okay, intermediate students will get 5 or a 6. Now, getting the best results. Okay, so for example, the any exam is like, you're competing in the Olympics. You need to show off your skills at that moment. Okay, in less than 15 minutes, you have to be able to do this. So what do you do? How do you get the best result in the exam? So you should be using different tenses, different sentence structures, simple, complex, synonyms for words that the examiner said in the questions, pronouncing words nice and clearly. You're understandable. You actually listen very carefully to the questions, so you're not making a mistake with the answer. Now, something you don't want to do is you don't want to use long words when you don't know what they mean. When you can't be accurate with a complex word or a high-level word, it's even worse. And don't try to memorize questions, because it sounds very bad. It sounds like you have memorized the answer, and you will get points taken off for that. So I would like for you to tell me what you think is the hardest part about the speaking test. Which part do you find most difficult? And what skills do you think you need to work on hardest? That is the question that you have to ask yourself. And if you like, you can share with me what those are, and I will try to help you as best as possible. So, till we meet again. Bye-bye.